is always a time of transition. School years start, elections roll around. Depending on your climate, the leaves might even start to change color. And here at CommonWealth Beacon, we are going through a transition too, saying goodbye to our editor of 16 years, Bruce Mole, and welcoming the excellent Laura Colarusso to head up the newsroom. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Laura, our new editor-in-chief, to introduce her to you and talk about what thoughtful, responsive, civic-minded journalism looks like in this very turbulent time for the U.S. and specifically the journalism industry. But first, a bit about her. We'll get into her early years in journalism, but she comes to us after more than 3 years at Nieman Reports, which is the Harvard University Nieman Foundation magazine focused on the journalism industry. Before that, she was digital managing editor at GBH News and a digital opinion editor at the Boston Globe. Laura, I am so glad we could do this. Thank you so much for being here on the Codcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, when you came on, during an extremely important election week, no less, we talked a bit about the idea that journalism is, in its best form, a public service to you. What did you actually mean by that?
A couple of things. First of all, I think the focus of the journalism should be to help people better understand the world around them, make informed decisions as citizens, and create ultimately a community. I think the service part of public service is really key because it's about creating knowledge and information that serves a community, however that's defined. That's what I mean in theory, but for the CommonWealth Beacon, I really think it means telling people about their government and what the government is doing for them, but also how their tax money is being spent and how the policies that the government puts into place ultimately affects their lives. And I think, just to unpack that a little further, I think really implicit in this is the idea that there's a rigorous adherence to ethical standards and treating the reporting process almost like the scientific method. I promised you that I wouldn't talk about Walter Lippmann. He wrote in 1919 about the ills that were affecting the journalism industry at that point. And he was really concerned with how there weren't a lot of ethical standards. And what he wanted people to do was interrogate their interviewees. He wanted them to interrogate the information that they were getting so that they were creating a better product ultimately for people. That's what I think public service journalism is.
Have you thought about this? I'm sure you have, but to give you a very leading question here, about this in terms of the great debate over objectivity, the idea of what it might mean for a journalist to use their brain not just to figure out what might be a story, but to really think about what they're hearing as they report it, to kind of check their biases, to check their subjects' biases. Is that connected here, that kind of rigorous strategy?
To me, objectivity is not the right word. I know that there's a big debate about it in our industry right now. I think trying to sum it up in one word is really unhelpful because, people are going to have their biases. But if you're focused on the reporting process itself and you're making sure that you're talking to a range of people, that you're contextualizing the information that you have, you don't have to put it all in your story or in whatever you wind up producing. But if you have the context to really understand what different data points or scoops or bits of information, the context around those things, then I think you have a pretty rigorous reporting process. And you might actually come to a place where, it's not balanced. You don't have two sides equally weighted, but you have something that is somewhat objective because you've gone through a process that allows you to really interrogate yourself, your biases, and the information that you're gathering.
That does sort of have hidden inside of this idea that journalists have a responsibility here, and that really gets at that public service ethos, which I guess I'm curious, where does that actually come from for you?
I think part of it is just decades of experience in this industry and watching the trust fall out of the bottom. There's a large part of our industry that has gotten away from gathering information that's really important to people so they can live their lives, and it's been replaced by hot takes and opinion reporting that's maybe not so based in fact. But at every news organization that I've ever worked at, it has been borne out that people might react to the hot takes, but they become loyal, they form trust to places that offer solid reporting. And if you'll indulge me for just 1 minute, I would also like to talk about my parents here. My mom is a registered nurse. She's a retired registered nurse, and she worked often with people who are at the end of their lives and helped them and their families through a very difficult process. And my dad also went to work every day for the federal government for several decades and helped veterans, the elderly, the disabled people get their Social Security checks. He was in charge of an office that dispersed government funds that way. And I remember talking to him about how people really relied on those checks. And even after he left that job, he retired, he went to go work for the county government, helping to apply for grants for low-income housing and for the unhoused community in the area where they live. And I don't know that either of them would really articulate it like they really served people in their careers, but that's what I took from it, that they helped people. And so that's how I look at what I do with journalism. Ultimately, I want to help people be, more informed citizens and, know more about their community so they have choices.
And so your version of this public service perspective ended up being in news. And if we think about the news business as an ecosystem, which we talk about a lot here, it's got different publications, audiences, focuses. And so it also sort of makes sense that the people that also do that work find their way through a variety of doors. And journalism didn't actually start out as your calling, right? But it was something that did eventually end up calling out to you.
I am not one of those people that knew early on. I did not write for my high school or my college newspaper. After I graduated from college, I didn't have a job. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I played tennis in college, and so I taught tennis for a little bit to make ends meet. But I eventually found my way into a job at what used to be Court TV. I think it's now True TV. And I started my career there, and it was there that I started to understand the power of information, and not just how important the information itself is, but how it is disseminated to broad swaths of people. That was in New York, and then from there I moved to DC and started writing about the military, and I did that for several years. I started in DC just before 9/11, before the terrorist attacks, and I was covering the Pentagon. So I had, at a very young age, very early on in my career, the ability to walk through the Pentagon with a press pass as, the global war on terrorism was kicking off, running through the halls of Congress, talking to, different senators and representatives about, what our military was doing and how we're going to fund it and what the personnel issues that were coming out of the high operations tempo at the time. And from there, I went to journalism school and sort of made my switch into more digital journalism. But at this point in my career, I have worked, I think, in almost every type of media. I've worked in TV, newspapers, magazines, radio, digital only, covered a wide variety of topics from the military to climate change to the pay gap, the gender pay gap, to local politics, actually. When I was at GBH, I did quite a bit on actually women's representation in our state legislature. So I've zigged and I've zagged, but it's all led me here.
If you'll indulge me, if turnabout is fair play, what does it feel like to you when you realize something's a story? Because, of course, you're going to be and are currently my editor, but also you come at this from a reporting perspective. So it can be helpful, I think, to think about how you identify what a story is, what it feels like to suddenly see these dots connect, and then how that connects to actually encouraging that sort of strategy in reporters that you then end up overseeing.
So I think part of this is honed over 2 decades of working in the industry, and I think I've just sort of developed a sense for what an audience is for a particular publication and what a good story would be for that audience. I hope it's not corny to say that when a good story idea comes together, there's a small spark of joy. The story meeting is my favorite part of my job. I love getting together with reporters, editors, just bringing the group together and bouncing ideas off of each other. Those have been some of the best stories that we've ever worked on, when we come in with ideas, but then we say, hey, wait a second, what about this? With more brains together come better story ideas. So I think it's just a moment of joy. Like, I think this is going to work out and it's going to be exciting, and hopefully we'll say something that people will really, it'll be really useful to them. And then, there's also like a sheer bit of panic or terror, because once we know we've got a good story idea, I don't want anybody to beat us. I'm really competitive that way. So it's just a matter of, after that, getting it done and coming up with a plan to get it done.
Are there sorts of stories that you've really kind of felt gripped by in your career? You've kind of covered everything.
I really love, I don't know if you'd call it data reporting. Let me give you an example of a story that I did. It was for WGBH. It was right after Donald Trump was sworn in as president, and we had started hearing these narratives about how women, there was going to be a political movement of women who rose up and started running for office and would remake the face of our elected government because there'd be so many women running for and being elected to government. And then the 2018 election happened, and it seemed like that was happening. It was partly true. But I wanted to understand what that meant in Massachusetts, because there are a lot of old boy networks in Massachusetts. And so I was really curious what kind of progress we had made at the State House. And so we looked at that, but then also we got the idea to look at the select boards and to see what the very, very local representation was like. We looked at select boards and school committees. And I spent the better part of 6 months going through all of the websites for 351 cities and towns to see what that representation looked like. We wound up collating all the data to show that actually Massachusetts has a very low percentage of women in government, in elected positions. Maura Healey is our first elected female governor. Elizabeth Warren was our first elected female senator. So, we're a very progressive state in some ways, but, women were not being well represented in elected politics. That's the kind of story I love to do, where I think the answer was you could kind of see it, but we had to piece it together. And it was calling so many select boards, trying to figure out who was on these boards. And then we also compared it to 10 years ago, the 10 years prior, so we could see change. And there was not much change in 10 years. So that's the kind of story I love to do. If you're asking me about topics, there's so many worthy topics, and our challenge is going to be how to cover them with 5 of us. So going forward, education is going to be a key topic for us. I personally would like to do some reporting around public health, climate, and environment in Massachusetts. And that's not to say I picked those out because they have been things that I've written about in the past, but there are a lot of priorities here in Massachusetts that we could talk about: transportation, housing, energy, all these things. So we're going to have to kind of sift through and figure out what we can reasonably get to as a staff of 5.
I'm going to pivot to the most macro and difficult question, which is, how are you feeling about the journalism industry right now? You've spent years at a publication that literally does journalism about journalism. It's no secret that many local papers have been hollowed out. Regional and national monoliths are some of the few that have actually managed to survive in this environment. I mean, what do you make of that?
I mean, this is an 8-hour podcast, right? We have that much time to talk about that. How do I feel about that? I mean, I cycle through a range of emotions and thoughts, but I think, like anything else, and pretty much anything that we report on, the issues that we're facing in journalism are multifaceted and extremely nuanced. And so there will not be a one-size-fits-all answer to the ailments that we're dealing with. And one of those big ones that, especially at Neiman, I was very focused on was news deserts. I think, especially in relation to news deserts, and as we try to think through as a country with a lot of money coming into the space from nonprofits, like how are we going to, and philanthropic dollars coming in, how are we going to fix that problem? One thing that I somewhat worry about is trading off innovation for reporting. Technological innovation is so important in so many aspects of life, and in journalism too, but I think sometimes we think that the innovation is going to get us out of this crisis because we can do good reporting with fewer journalists. And we can. Technology has helped us with that to a certain extent. But at the end of the day, if we go back to the public service aspect of the job, I think that's very community oriented, and you need people in communities. And technology doesn't necessarily help you with that. Like maybe you might have a financial paper that can write up a earnings report with AI, but that's not going to help you create that bond with a reader or a listener or a watcher that allows them to feel like, okay, you're a trustworthy news organization. I know the people behind this, and so I want to support them, and I know that I can trust what they're saying. The other thing I think a lot about in relation to the state of our industry is about the distribution networks. A lot of the way people find journalism now is through search, through Google, and it's through social media, which, that's all algorithmically based. That's not something we have control over, like we had control over delivering newspapers or terrestrial radio or, when you would watch linear television, right? And so thinking about how we still reach people despite not having control over the main ways that people get their news now is something that I think we really have to grapple with. And then I used to say that we had ceded control over the distribution networks. At least we had control over the stories, over the journalism. And now with AI, that might also be changing. So these are the things that I think about. I don't know that I have great answers for them, but I think it's just as an industry, we have to grapple with that. And different types of organizations within the industry will have different answers and different resources to deal with these problems. And so trying to figure out, like obviously the New York Times can go to court with OpenAI. Smaller places, it's a little bit tougher.
Listeners of the Codcast know that I think about the perils and promise, etc. of AI all the time. We're going to not have a crisis right now on your first Codcast. So instead, I'm going to ask, how does this all sort of connect to CommonWealth? Because here we talk about civic journalism law, which does feel philosophically related to that public service framework, right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think they're two sides of the same coin. Both approaches are really about how do we get information to people so they better understand their world. And, for the Commonwealth Beacon, I think very much about what policymakers are doing and how that affects people's lives. I think it's essentially the same thing. It's just our focus happens to be more politics, political, issue-based.
So how do you then make the case, generally speaking at least, because we're still pretty early in the Commonwealth process here, that local journalism, thoughtful journalism, has a place in that industry ecosystem where the distribution networks have changed, where a basic relationship between reader and publication is often changed? And we also hear all the time about how short attention spans are, how siloed media consumption is. And to your point about social media, I think there was a study a little while ago that came out from Pew that found that a higher and higher percentage of each subsequent generation is getting their news from social media. And to be honest, it can feel like a little bit of a mess. You do good journalism, but then what is the point if you can't find people to read it?
The landscape has become somewhat cacophonous, right? It's hard to break through all that noise. To answer your question about local journalism's place in that ecosystem, I think about local journalism as the building block, the biggest part of the pyramid of trust, because I think it's easier for people to trust local news because you often know the reporters, you often see them at events. You can go to a select board meeting and actually see what's happening and then compare that to what the journalist is writing, and it's easy to verify that. That's not the case with national media, and it's not to say that national media doesn't have its place. It does extraordinarily important work, but I think local news is really important. It's the building block to building the trust, which we know, which we talked about before, has been bottoming out for our industry. And I also think that, going back to the idea of community, local news creates community. One of our, I wouldn't call them a competitor, but Mass Live is now expanding their sports news offerings to people. And I think it's because, well, I don't know why, I'm not going to say why they're doing it, but I think it's kind of brilliant because I think people care about their local sports teams. I think being able to see yourself reflected in that coverage could make for a very loyal audience. So I think that's part of it. And then also when I worked at Neiman, we wrote about this study that was done out of Harvard, the Harvard Business School actually, where the researchers went and looked at what happened to communities after a local newspaper closed and the relationship between the paper closing and corruption in local businesses. And they found a correlation between papers closing and more enforcement actions. And this is why local news is important. There is a real watchdog function of it as well that bigger national news can't cover for people. I think both of those things indicate that. And I'm sure there are many more reasons too. But I think those two things make a pretty strong case for local news.
I joke sometimes that it's not accurate to say Massachusetts places are as simple as either well-covered versus news deserts, though, of course, there are places that are one or the other, plenty of them. But it sometimes feels, the metaphor I tend to go with is like layers of cheesecloth. With enough news outlets doing diligent work, you get the sense that the state is effectively blanketed in journalism. You can list out all of these publications that we're really lucky to have, but then when you actually get into these communities, and I was a local reporter for years, so I feel this deeply, many of these communities would have what I guess you'd call in this metaphor pretty large gaps in that weave. So they might technically fall, right, under the auspices of a few news outlets, but have very little regular and meaningful local coverage. So a two-part question, which I'm sure you'll love, is one, sort of where do you see gaps in the Massachusetts reporting landscape? And then what does it mean for us to talk about being a statewide news organization that also cares about doing our version of local news?
So I think Massachusetts is like any other state. Every state has seen a decline in the number of news organizations. I think we might be slightly better off than others. I actually looked up the data, the State of Local News Report. I think the numbers, we've lost about 20 news organizations in the last decade or so, which is not great. I mean, it's not as bad off as some other places. But Massachusetts isn't unique in that in the areas where there's less population density, where there's less wealth, it's harder to keep local news organizations. And so you tend to see more rural communities not have coverage. And it's, some of this is on a geographic basis, but also if you were to look at county by county, obviously, like, Suffolk County, where Boston is, and Middlesex County, where some of the wealthier suburbs are, there are quite a few news organizations. And once you start to head a little bit west, it gets a little bit more sparse. I think one other nuance to get at here is even when you still have a news organization, sometimes they're ghost papers or ghost organizations where, it might be a national chain owns the paper and it's really more of a regional hub. So they're not doing local news. They're doing sort of regional news that's pulled in from a lot of different places because they're trying to save money. Maybe they have one reporter or one editor on the ground, but they don't actually have news people there covering the local community. So I think that's the big difference too.
So what does that actually then mean for us? How do I put my little local news heart to best purpose here when I can't physically, of course, traverse the entire state in an afternoon looking for that kind of very niche reporting?
Well, this might be where technology helps us. We can Zoom into meetings. Press releases now come across the transom pretty regularly, piece stories together that way. I think for us, it will mean, because we are still a small staff, it will mean picking and choosing the right stories to go after. But, there might be some travel westward in your future, Jen. There might be, so.
Gotta go buy a car or something. That's gonna scare our producer, who's a dogged bicyclist and is gonna be glaring at me through a Zoom. So I guess it connects to this idea, right, about the balance of, to exactly that point, sort of finding readers where they are, finding listeners where they are physically, and then also making sure that journalism is available for those who come looking, who start doing that Google search, who plug in the name of their town and political or something after that. So I've been thinking a lot about the impact of those news silos and the argument that nobody has time for long or thoughtful journalistic explorations, and then at the same time news organizations don't have the capacity to really embed reporters in those communities. How is that hitting you?
Yeah, I mean that's a lot to unpack and try to deal with. Let me take it step by step. The first question about finding the readers, I think part of it is a technical question in our digital age, and I'm not going to bore people with very technical terms here, but there are ways to deal with, Google and, the social media networks that helps extend our reach. And some of that is, I will say one technical term, like search engine optimization, right? So there are some tools of the trade that we can use. It's really more about making sure that we have really strong journalism. I think I know it sounds vague and I don't mean to be vague, but the stuff that cuts through, and I've seen this again in every news organization that I've worked at, the stuff that cuts through is the stuff that really tells people something they don't already know. If you're breaking a story, if you're uncovering corruption, if you're actually just putting dots together in a way that makes people think differently about an issue they've thought about a lot before, people will find that. People will click on that story because it's important. And so I think that's part and parcel to it. I think just like really focusing on good journalism in and of itself.
So where do opinions sections enter into this? Because we at CommonWealth, we don't do editorials, but we've got a pretty robust op-ed page.
They are definitely a part of a conversation. They start conversations. They allow for analysis, expertise to weigh in on important issues. I think the most important thing for me is, are they grounded in fact? And I'm not saying that they haven't been at CommonWealth Beacon in the past, but that's the main standard that I would judge the editorials by. And, That all being said, I don't think that most people who don't work in the journalism industry understand that there is really quite a strict separation between the opinion side of news organizations and the actual news gathering staff. And so I want to say that very clearly now, and I will reiterate it, that the opinion side will be very separate from the news side. It could be that distinction doesn't matter much to people anymore. I can't say in this particularly divisive time that we're in that it might be a distinction without a difference, but I believe in a very hard line between news and opinion.
Lastly, I think let's take a broader look ahead. What are you watching and preparing to respond to in the next year? We've talked about trust in media being low. Donald Trump is president, and his campaign actually specifically shouted out podcast and influencer universes as critical to his win, so talking about those other sorts of distribution networks. But then at the same time, one thing that's been quite heartening to me is in some places we are seeing local news nonprofits blossom and expand. One thing that's really great about CommonWealth, kind of in my experience being here, is connection between outlets is more possible with a content sharing model, especially with nonprofits. So to jump off of that kind of hopeful, joyful thing that you feel when you're putting a story together, I guess, is there a similar feeling about something in the journalism universe right now? How does journalism still look like journalism, but also adapt?
I think it goes back to rigorous reporting. When the hard work is done, the reporting definitely breaks through. And thinking of the New York Times's and the New Yorker's exposés on Harvey Weinstein, right? That launched a movement. ProPublica shined a light on the ethics scandals at the Supreme Court. That was a big deal. That not much came of it, but it was an important thing for people to know. The University of Florida, the student newspaper at the University of Florida, uncovered how the president, Ben Sasse, had been making all these sweetheart deals with friends in Washington, and that his office's budget had grown by some factor that was quite large. So there's still a lot of really good work being done. I think I take comfort in that even when the industry is facing pretty difficult headwinds, polarization in this country is real, and it's, something that we all are grappling with. There's still really excellent work being done that is breaking through and making change. And I think, the more we focus on that, the more we focus on what we can control, the better off we'll be.
Thanks again to Laura Colarusso for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. Again, I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us. Don't forget to subscribe to CommonWealth Beacon newsletters if you aren't already, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.